In our last lecture for this unit, we're going to be talking about human-caused natural selection, so changes in species that are due to human influence. Now, traditionally, this has been called artificial selection. I'm going to make a case for you that's a little bit of a misnomer, and maybe applies as an okay word to use for purposeful, directed human natural selection, but there's a lot of other human-caused natural selection that is not purposeful, it's accidental, incidental, or maybe accidental, depending on the situation. We'll look at a couple. But this word has been used for so long that it's probably here to stay. So we'll call it artificial selection. But remember, humans are a species. We evolved here on Earth like any other species. And although we have certainly much more influence than most species and ability to understand the world around us and manipulate it and master the world around us in ways that other species can't even get close to, we still are part of the environment. So calling anything that a human does to impact the evolution of another species artificial selection is a little bit, well, it's just wrong. And trying to draw a line on where, okay, if humans are directing it and doing it on purpose, then we'll call it artificial selection. But if they're not directing it, if it's accidental, we'll just consider humans part of the environment. That's a really hard line to draw. So it's really hard to make a objective case for artificial selection because either it will apply too broadly to anything that humans do to impact evolution, or too narrowly without a nice line to draw. But let's just look at some easy examples. Your book uses many of these. So all of the members of the cabbage family that we eat come from one single wild species. It's a type of a mustard. It's actually fairly closely related to Arabidopsis, which is a model plant, the one that's used most commonly for gene studies and anytime you need a model organism and you're studying plants. So if you don't like broccoli and cauliflower and Brussels sprouts, they should be on here also. But if you don't like those, you really are just not liking all of one species. But different lineages of this species have been selected for different traits. So we have genes that were there in the population already or popped up randomly as people were cultivating them. And then they noticed, oh, this plant's a little different. It makes really dense leaves all packed together. That's kind of nice. Let's keep those. Oh, look, here's one that has these enlarged lateral meristems near the root, right? And it makes this little bulb on the bottom. So, oh, that's kind of fun. And I like to eat it, or at least some of my family likes to eat it. So let's keep those, and so on and so forth. And so each of these are still classified as the same species, but with certain traits just bred for and modified for. And if they're not careful, they can actually interbreed, and so you can get mixes of these, which actually might not be always bad, but you're probably going to lose some of the traits in either species if you mix them together. And in fact, if you look at any human crop, almost any human crop, there have been major, major changes. Some crops were pretty much the same, or at least close to what they are now as humans eat them. They were just valuable already for food sources. But even the valuable ones have often been modified, and often to an extreme degree. So in South America, there was a wild grass, we call it teosinte, that had these kind of enlarged seeds. And they were somewhat nutritious. You could cook them. They were hard to eat, but you could cook them. And if you gathered a lot of them, you could get a meal out of it. And so humans, when they arrived in South America, began to gather it and eventually began to cultivate it. And as they did, they noticed that there was variability, that there were some that created bigger seeds or softer seeds, and those were a little bit better. So they kept those. They threw away the seeds from the older ones, and they kept a few of the seeds from the really good one. They planted those. And after many generations, they had a much improved crop. And after many more generations, we're talking hundreds of generations, hundreds of years, going into the thousands of years, we end up with a very different descendant that came from this ancestor. And of course, there's variety. So we still have corn that's grown for popcorn, and corn that's grown primarily to feed cattle, and then corn that's sweet corn and is grown for human consumption. So even then, there have been multiple lineages that have been kept to emphasize different traits, much like this one. And ancestors are very, very different than today's modern descendants. And in some cases, the ancestors are still growing wild, so we can find them and compare the genetic pool, which probably has changed very little because of very weak natural selection in the wild, or maybe a back and forth. So it's changed some, right? Evolution always occurs. but it's going to be much more similar to the ancestor of corn, the wild teosinte, than what's going on. But it's important to remember that what we have today is not the ancestor, even though it might be classified as the same species. It's not the exact same population that gave rise to our modern ones, but it's probably fairly close because natural selection is usually slow when it is in the natural environment. Now, there are certain cases where it can be very rapid, but artificial selection is basically the best case scenario for rapid phenotypic change, because humans, when they are really serious about doing something, can impose very strict, rigid breeding guidelines on the crops or the animals that they are interested in. So only a very, very tiny fraction of the corn gets to produce the next generation. And then we look for more variety and diversity, and we continue that over and over again. So it's not anything different than natural selection. It is just humans that are directing it, and it's often much more focused and long-term than environments, which can be stable and will have droughts and then wet years. And so even though we could potentially get the same speed of selection occurring naturally, humans tend to force it to be on the extreme when they're very interested in the outcome. And sometimes we have wild populations, other times we don't. So for instance, all of our domesticated cattle and all of the breeds came from a single species of wild bovine called the aurochs. And this was found in southern Europe and down into Africa, a little bit in the Middle East, and was quite large and strong, was actually hunted for many thousands of years, but eventually was domesticated, a smaller, probably less aggressive strain. Maybe they were aggressive originally, and then people selected for less and less aggressive breeds, and then later selected for the many different strains that we have today, from beef cattle to milk cattle, and everything in between. Okay? And the modern aurochs is no longer around, but many of its genetic traits are still kept in the different breeds of cows. And in fact, there is an attempt today to bring the aurochs back from extinction by crossbreeding different types of cows to get a population that has many of the physical characteristics, at least. We don't know for sure about the genetic ones because they're extinct, but maybe many of the physical ones. So they're trying to de-extinctify, if that's a word, but de-extinct the aurochs by breeding and at least reconstructing or recombining many of those ancestral traits that have now been separated out into these different breeds of cattle. And of course, dogs are an extreme example. All breeds of dogs, are the exact same species, and they all came from a wolf, usually not that long ago. And there's some debate as to whether all domesticated dogs are a single domestication event and then propagation of that, or maybe 2 or 3 different times when humans domesticated wolves, and that's how we get our different breeds. But despite the incredible physical differences between these two individuals, we could put a Chihuahua and a Great Dane and everything in between, these are the same species. And although we have selected for a very few morphological traits, most of the rest of the traits are about the same. And so physically they look different, but genetically they're very similar. Just one last example, we could do just about any crop or any domesticated animal. But all of the stone fruits came from a single ancestor. So we're talking nectarines, peaches, plums, cherries, all these fruits that have a central large pit in the middle, all came from a single species and have been bred since. And they're still very, very closely related. So much so that you can graft cherry branches onto a peach tree or plum tree or vice versa and create kind of a fruit cocktail tree. There's a record somewhere where there have been like 20 or 30 different varieties all grafted onto one trunk to make, all of these different kinds of stone fruit. Okay, so humans can have a massive impact, and if they do it over a long period of time and do it in a focused manner, we can get massive dramatic changes. And all of our domesticated crops, all of our domesticated animals are signs of that intent. And early on, humans didn't really know the mechanisms, but they knew what they were doing, right? They said, hey, look, this little bit of corn growing in the corner of my plot is better to eat than the rest. Oh, instead of, they were smart. Instead of just eating it all and saying, oh, that was nice, they say, let's save some of it. So they knew about inheritance of traits, even if they didn't know the exact mechanism. They knew that parents often would produce offspring that were very similar to themselves. And so it was very purposeful and intentful, even anciently, before we knew anything about the process of evolution. Humans were harnessing the power of evolution without even really knowing what it was. And in fact, some species were quote unquote pre-adapted to domestication by humans, either because of a trait that had been useful in the past. So, for instance, wolves have this pack behavior where they have a structure in their society with a lead, an alpha dog, alpha male, alpha female, and then other ones that are subservient to that one. And so if you get a wild wolf and raise it in an environment where it is basically being acculturated, right? It's learning the culture of the quote unquote pack. And if you make it so the human is the alpha, and they recognize that human is the alpha, then they will often be very subservient and helpful. Now, wolves still have a lot of other wild traits, and so it's not as successful. And as generations went by, many of the more aggressive traits were bred out of them. Although, we still can see some of the ancestral wolf traits in different breeds. Okay, but the wolf was pre-adapted to domestication because of its pack tendency. Cats, although they have become domesticated, are really much less predisposed, and that's why they maintain many of their independent traits. In fact, some people argue that cats really are more living commensally with humans and haven't been fully domesticated because they are still very, very similar to their ancestors. And in fact, if you release a kitten into the wild, it has a much better chance of surviving and be able to get its own food and live than if you would put a puppy into the wild. Still a possibility, right? But much less so because dogs have been bred and domesticated both behaviorally and physically, so they're much more different than their ancestors than the cat is. But to one degree or another, all of our domestic plants, all of our domestic animals have been changed and modified to fit better into our wants and needs, some of them more than others. Now, in addition to this very focused type of selection, which we're going to call artificial selection, many times humans have accidentally influenced natural selection. So I'm going to look at 3 examples, but we could probably do dozens. The first is, we'll look at dogs again. In addition to selecting for desirable traits, whatever those were, right? Hunting skills or tracking skills, or digging and ability to find small rats, or sometimes more recently it's just, that's cute, and so let's select for it. Okay, but as people did that, they inadvertently brought along other traits along with them. And if we have a wide range of organisms and we select from a wide range of dogs that are all small and do that very carefully with lots of breeding stock, we can maintain the rest of the genetic diversity and still make a dog small. But often humans were not so worried about that, and they were so focused on making a dog small, for instance, that they had such a narrow bottleneck each generation. They picked such few individuals to recapitulate and make the next generation that they inevitably selected for other traits that were just present by random chance, and some of those were bad. So, for instance, many breeds are known to have very severe genetic disorders, and this is an article that talks about 10 of them, that some of them are very specific to certain breeds. So aortic stenosis, or heart problems, right? Allergic dermatitis, so they get skin rashes, right? Gastric dilation, which means they have digestive problems, right? Early onset cataracts. And these were not things that people were saying, wouldn't it be cool if my dog got early cataracts? Let's select for that. But they'd select for a certain trait from such a small population that they accidentally brought along some of these other traits that were maybe present only in a very small percentage of the population. So the genetic disorders that are, especially our dogs, but many of our other crops possess, are an example of inadvertent artificial selection. Drug resistance, right? We have many bacteria and other organisms that historically were easy to treat with an antibiotic. You give a course of penicillin and boom, you're clear. But today, because of the way that we have handled prescription and maybe not being as careful as we should have, we have inadvertently selected for multiple drug-resistant strains. Like gonorrhea is a big issue now. Again, if you got gonorrhea back in the 40s or 50s, right after penicillin was invented, you take a course of penicillin and you're cured, nearly 100%. But some people didn't take the whole course, and so the penicillin came back, the gonorrhea came back. So they would take another course, and maybe they didn't take on. So this repeated exposure in not ideal situations, but repeated exposure of bacteria to antibiotics selected for multiple resistance. And we talked about that a little bit when we looked at selection of strains of bacteria. But that was not on purpose. Humans did it accidentally, right? And now we have weeds that are resistant to our glyphosate, which is Roundup. That's the common term for Roundup. And originally Roundup was great. It worked on everything, but now it took a while. But now we're having weeds that are now resistant to this weed killer that was once so effective. So the take-home message that we learn is that evolution is inevitable. It's always going to be happening, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. And so if we can understand it, then perhaps we can understand how our actions as a species, as a group, would maybe negatively impact the species. And so we could reduce negative impacts. So for instance, if we had been more careful about breeding dogs, we would have much fewer genetic problems if we had taken a wider stock and a little bit more time to breed down to the specific traits that we wanted, so that we could weed out the rare mutants instead of bringing them along with the traits we were breeding for. If we had been more careful about how we prescribed and used antibiotics, we'd have much less drug resistance among bacteria, right? So we can't stop it completely, but we can slow down or maybe a little bit more specifically direct evolutionary forces when we are aware of them. So it's important that we understand how our actions impact the species around us. Now, here's another example of why you maybe wouldn't call this artificial selection. So over and over again, humans have accidentally introduced new species to environments where they were presently nothing at all like them. The cane toad was brought into Australia as it was supposed to help reduce crop pests. It was going to eat the bugs that were eating crops. But although it may have done that, it also found ways to thrive in the wild. So it didn't thrive just in the sugarcane fields where it was originally brought in. It also thrived in the wild, especially in the north. So the red line shows the boundary of where they're found, and potentially they could expand even farther. The dry south, where there's either it gets too cold or it's too dry, they can't survive. But they are a huge, huge problem. So much so that they've caused extinction and pressure, ecological pressure, on many, many of the native species. And some environments are more prone to extinction than others because they have not been exposed to many species. So islands, particularly the Hawaiian Islands, have been massive sites of extinction. Hundreds of different bird species have gone extinct in Hawaii, some of which are only known very superficially because we might only have written records of them or even historical verbal records from the ancient Hawaiian people that have been passed down to their descendants. And we know that there was this bird, or we might see its feathers being used in a traditional Hawaiian headdress or something like that. That's from thousands of years ago, but they're all gone today. And the vast majority of these, there was pressure put on them by native Hawaiians who would hunt them primarily because most of them were small species. They'd hunt them for their feathers for decoration. But once Europeans arrived and they brought in cats and rats and mongooses and all these other species, some on purpose, others accidentally, they inadvertently have dramatically shifted the direction of evolution in the Hawaiian Islands. And so do we call that artificial selection because humans did it, even if they didn't do it on purpose? And even if it's not humans, it's the species that humans brought. So you can see how drawing this line in this definition of artificial selection might be hard. But humans certainly do direct lots. And so today in our modern society, we have brand new genetic tools, much, much more powerful and much easier than we've ever had in the past. And so we can take genetic tools and we can manipulate them. So we could take a gene in salmon that allows them to grow big, and we could duplicate that gene. So now they have 2 copies of it and they grow that much faster. Okay? That is a genetically modified organism. We did it not by breeding. Now realize that genetically modified organisms really could apply to any organism that humans have artificially selected for. We've genetically modified teosinte into modern corn. It's just that we had to do it slowly. We had to do it using changes that randomly popped up through mutation, through natural processes of mutation, and that we could not direct it. So ancient Mayans couldn't go in and say, oh, I wish I had big corn. Oh, let's take these genes that make corn grow large and let's overexpress them or make extra copies of them. Boom, we've got large corn. If they had the tools, they could have done it. And today we can do that, but it's already been done slowly with more traditional approaches. But still, corn, any crop, any domesticated animal, they are genetically modified, but with slower, more limited means. And today we can do it much faster. So here's another example. This is golden rice. It has been genetically modified using modern tools to express beta carotene, basically vitamin A, in the rice. So normally this is not expressed in the rice. Like rice is a very energy-rich, carbohydrate-rich food source, but very vitamin-poor. But now we get not only the carbohydrates and the energy, but we also get vitamins. And this can be critically important for populations that don't have enough vitamin A and use rice as their primary calorie source. So it's a really valuable tool, but it was found through genetic modification. One more example, and again, there are dozens of these. Many crops, including cotton, are now primarily what we would call BT modified. BT is short for bacteriogenesis, I forget the genus name, but it's Thurogenoides, like bacterium anyway. It's the genus and species abbreviation for a type of bacterium that kills insects. If insects eat this bacteria because of a chemical product that they produce, it actually breaks open the internal gut of the insect and they die. And the bacteria evolved that as a defense against the insects. However, we have been able to take that gene and splice it into the genome of cotton, other crops too, but splice it into the genome of cotton. And now if a caterpillar, a beetle, eats the cotton, it will die because it carries that bacteriotoxin. And that bacteriotoxin is completely harmless to vertebrates. It only works against those invertebrates. So it's really, really safe. And not only that, but it greatly reduces our need to spray pesticides on these fields because they're much less susceptible to herbivory from these pests. So I want to just make this point that we have been making genetically modified crops and animals as long as we have been artificially selecting for different species. Now we just have better tools to do it. And it's not automatically a bad thing. I think for many people, there's this knee-jerk reaction that when they see genetically modified organism, they think, oh, like Frankenstein species, and it's going to be really, really bad. There are certainly things that could go wrong, and certainly we need to be careful and do careful studies about the impact of these changes that we're making on the species. What would happen if they got out into the wild? Would they replace wild populations and outcompete them? And in most cases, the answer is probably not. They're probably only going to work as in human cultivation or as we're raising these animals in a human modified environment. So with the right oversight, genetically modified organisms with our modern tools can have a huge and very, very beneficial. We can reduce ecological impact like the spraying of pesticides. We can increase nutritional value without doing anything else other than the modification. So this vitamin A corn, rice, you don't have to do anything else. It grows in the same environments, uses up the same amount of nutrients. It just does an extra chemical reaction to make more vitamin A in the kernel of the rice. So there can be great value for genetically modified organisms. We should move forward with caution, but we should not dismiss genetically modified organisms just because we've used modern tools to change them rather than the old traditional tools of artificial selection.